In the blue waters of the Mediterranean, a young German commander of only 28 years lurked in the depths with a deadly mission. It was November 25, 1941, and Hans-Diedrich von Tiesenhausen was about to change the course of naval warfare with a deadly salvo of torpedoes. His submarine U-331 had been following for hours one of the most powerful ships of the British Royal Navy, which carried more than 1,200 souls aboard. What would happen in the next few minutes would become one of the most devastating sinkings of World War II, where 862 men would lose their lives. HMS Barham was no ordinary ship. This British battleship weighed more than 31,000 tons and carried aboard more than 1,200 souls. It was a floating fortress armed with giant cannons capable of destroying entire cities. It had sailed the seas for more than 25 years, surviving World War I and now fighting in the Second. Its thick steel plates had resisted enemy attacks on multiple occasions. But that day, nothing could save it from what was about to come. Von Tiesenhausen had begun his career as a simple naval officer, but his story was more complex than it appeared. Although he had been born in Riga, then part of the Russian Empire, he belonged to the German Baltic aristocracy. His loyalty was not to Russia, but to the German Reich, and the war had turned him into one of the most feared submarine commanders of the ocean. The U-331 was his perfect weapon, a Type WWII submarine that could dive to 200 meters deep and fire deadly torpedoes from the shadows. It was like a steel shark, silent and lethal. The submarine crew was young, most barely past 20 years old, but they were trained to kill or die for their country. That morning, the Barham was sailing in formation with other British warships near the coasts of Egypt. The fleet was heading west, patrolling the waters to protect convoys carrying vital supplies to Allied troops. The commander of the Barham, Captain Geoffrey Cook, didn't know that death lurked beneath the waves. His lookouts scanned the horizon searching for threats, but the real danger was hundreds of meters under their feet, moving like a ghost in the darkness of the ocean. Von Tiesenhausen had detected the British fleet using his periscope. Through the small viewer, he could see the enormous warships cutting through the waves. His heart beat fast, but his hands remained steady. He knew he had a unique opportunity. The British didn't know he was there. He ordered his team to prepare the torpedoes. In the small and claustrophobic interior of the submarine, the sailors ran to their positions. The air was heavy and smelled of fuel and sweat. Every second counted. The plan was simple but deadly. Von Tiesenhausen would position his submarine at the perfect angle and fire a salvo of 3 torpedoes toward the Barham. Each torpedo carried enough explosives to open a giant hole in the hull of any ship. But aiming at a moving target from a submarine that was also moving was like trying to make a perfect shot while riding a wild horse. A miscalculation and the torpedoes would pass by, alerting the entire British fleet to his presence. At 4:25 in the afternoon, von Tiesenhausen gave the fatal order. The 3 torpedoes shot out from the tubes of U-331, leaving trails of white bubbles in the blue water. They traveled through the ocean like giant bullets, each loaded with 280 kilograms of explosives. The torpedoes had a life of their own. Their engines propelled them at 50 kilometers per hour directly toward the heart of the Barham. In the submarine, the German crew waited in total silence, holding their breath. The first 2 torpedoes struck the left side of the Barham almost at the same time. The impact was devastating. The explosions tore the steel like paper, opening mortal wounds in the hull of the gigantic ship. But it was the 3rd torpedo that sealed the fate of the Barham. This deadly projectile penetrated deeper, reaching the area where the ship's ammunition was stored. What happened next was something no one could have imagined. The explosion that followed was so powerful it was felt kilometers away. The Barham's ammunition depot exploded like an underwater volcano, creating a fireball that rose hundreds of meters into the sky. The sound was deafening, as if the ocean itself had screamed in pain. The 31,000-ton battleship split in half in a matter of seconds. One half sank immediately, while the other remained floating a few moments more before also disappearing beneath the waves. Von Tiesenhausen hadn't seen the explosion directly, but he had felt it. The sound traveled through the water and shook his submarine like an earthquake. His instruments went crazy for a moment. He knew he had hit something big, but he didn't know exactly what had happened. Only later would he learn that he had achieved one of the fastest sinkings in naval history. The powerful HMS Barham had disappeared in less than 5 minutes. On the surface, the tragedy was absolute. More than 1,200 souls had been aboard the Barham when the torpedoes struck it. Sailors, officers, cooks, doctors, engineers, all fought desperately to save their lives when the ship began to sink. Some managed to jump into the water before the ship broke apart, but many were trapped inside the sinking hull. The cold waters of the Mediterranean swallowed both heroes and common men alike. The British destroyers that accompanied the Barham immediately rushed to the area of the sinking. Their crews worked frantically to rescue the survivors floating in the water. They threw ropes, lifeboats, and everything they could find. But time worked against them. The water was cold and many men were injured by the explosion. Cries for help filled the air while the rescuers fought against the clock. In the end, only 395 men were rescued from the waters. This meant that 862 souls were lost forever in the depths of the Mediterranean. Families in England lost their fathers, sons, and brothers in a matter of minutes. Among the dead was Captain Cook, who, according to accounts, remained on the bridge of his ship until the end, fulfilling the naval tradition that the captain is the last to abandon ship. Meanwhile, U-331 silently moved away from the area. Von Tiesenhausen had ordered immediate escape after the attack. His submarine dove deeper and changed course to avoid the British destroyers that would now be searching for them. The German crew knew they had achieved something important, but they still didn't understand the magnitude of their success. They had sunk not just a ship, but a legend of the British Navy. The news of the Barham's sinking was kept secret by the British government for several months. They didn't want the public to know they had lost one of their most important battleships. War censorship kept the tragedy hidden until it was finally made public. When the news came to light, the impact on British morale was terrible. HMS Barham was considered practically invincible. For von Tiesenhausen, the sinking of the Barham became the most important moment of his military career. He was subsequently decorated with the Knight's Cross, one of the highest German distinctions. But his glory would not last forever. The war continued, and the ocean that had given him his greatest victory would eventually claim its price. U-331 continued operating in the Mediterranean, but its luck was about to change. In November 1942, exactly 1 year after the sinking of the Barham, U-331 was located by British aircraft near Algeria. The hunters had become the hunted. The submarine was repeatedly attacked from the air, and its hull was severely damaged. Von Tiesenhausen was forced to surface, where his submarine was completely exposed and vulnerable. The end of U-331 was as dramatic as its greatest victory. With the submarine damaged and unable to dive, von Tiesenhausen ordered his crew to raise a white flag as a sign of surrender. But when the British aircraft approached to capture the submarine, something went wrong. The British pilots, perhaps without seeing the white flag or believing it was a trap, continued their attack. A torpedo launched from an albacore aircraft struck the submarine on its right side. The explosion was devastating. 32 men died instantly, trapped inside the sinking hull. Von Tiesenhausen and only 16 more members of his crew survived the sinking of their submarine. Of the 49 men who had sailed in U-331, 32 lost their lives in those final tragic moments. The survivors were rescued by an American seaplane and taken as prisoners of war. The young commander who had changed the course of naval warfare would spend the rest of the conflict in prisoner camps in England and Canada. His war had ended, but the price paid by his crew had been terrible. The story of U-331 and HMS Barham became one of the most studied in naval academies around the world. It demonstrated how a small submarine with a determined crew could change the balance of power in the ocean. It also showed the brutal reality of submarine warfare, where death could come without warning from the depths. The sinking of the Barham marked the end of an era where great battleships dominated the seas. Today, the remains of HMS Barham lie at the bottom of the Mediterranean, more than 2,000 meters deep. It is the marine grave of 862 brave men who died serving their country. Marine researchers have located the wreck and confirmed that it broke apart exactly as the survivors described. The enormous pieces of the battleship are scattered across the seabed, covered by decades of sediment and marine life. Von Tiesenhausen survived the war and after being released in 1947, briefly returned to Germany where he worked as a carpenter. But in 1951 he made a decision that surprised many. He returned to Canada, the same country where he had been a prisoner of war. He settled in Vancouver, where he lived the rest of his life working as an interior designer and developing a passion for nature photography. He never talked much about his moment of glory, preferring to remember the men who died both on the Barham and on his own submarine. The war had given him fame, but had also taught him the true cost of victory. 32 of his own men had paid the ultimate price for his success, and in his later years he expressed respect for both the British sailors who had courageously faced his attack and for his German comrades who didn't return home. The sinking of HMS Barham remains as a reminder of how quickly fortune can change in war. In 5 minutes, a ship that had sailed the oceans for decades became a memory. More than 1,200 lives were put in danger by the actions of one man and his crew, and 862 of them were lost forever. This story teaches us about courage, sacrifice, and the terrible consequences of war, where heroes and tragedies often go hand in hand. If you like the video about the U-331, please like, comment, and subscribe.